There is a silence that comes with age that nobody ever prepares you for. Not the silence of a quiet room or a peaceful evening, but the kind of silence that settles deep inside your chest when you realize that most of the people you once loved are no longer here, and the ones who have grown so busy with their own lives that your phone barely rings anymore. That is the silence this is about. That is the kind of emptiness a 79-year-old woman named Margaret described when she sat down one afternoon and began to speak honestly, perhaps for the first time in years, about what growing old in the modern world actually feels like from the inside. She said, "Nobody tells you about this part. Everyone talks about the aching joints, the slower mornings, the medications lined up on the kitchen counter. But no one sits a young person down and says, 'Listen, there will come a day when the world moves on without you,' and the strangest thing about it is that it happens so gradually you almost do not notice until you are already in the middle of it." Margaret noticed on a Tuesday. She had made a pot of coffee, sat down at her kitchen table, and realized she had not spoken to another human being in 4 days. Not because she was unlovable, not because she had pushed people away, but simply because life, for everyone around her, had become a rush of schedules and notifications and demands that left very little room for an elderly woman who just wanted someone to sit and talk. This is a story that is happening in millions of homes right now. Researchers studying aging populations have found that between 15 and 25% of older adults experience persistent loneliness, a number that has been steadily climbing over the past 2 decades. This is not just a feeling. Chronic loneliness in older adults has been linked to cognitive decline, higher rates of depression, weakened immune response, and a significantly shorter lifespan. The Surgeon General of the United States has called loneliness an epidemic, and while that word gets used a lot these days, when you sit across from an elderly person and look into their eyes as they describe days that pass without a single meaningful conversation, the word epidemic starts to feel exactly right. Margaret is not unusual. She raised 3 children, worked for 30 years as a school librarian, volunteered every Saturday at a local food pantry, and built what she believed was a full and connected life. But retirement came, the children moved to different cities, her husband passed away 6 years ago, and the community that once surrounded her simply thinned out the way fog does on a warm morning. Slowly, and then all at once. She joined a seniors group at her church, but found that the activities did not quite match who she still felt she was on the inside. She tried to reconnect with old friends, but discovered that many of them were dealing with their own health challenges or had already passed on. She downloaded an app her granddaughter recommended and found herself more confused and more alone than before. What Margaret's story reveals is something that gerontologists have been documenting for years, but that mainstream culture has been slow to absorb. The outer world treats aging as a process of subtraction, a slow removal of capacity and relevance, but most older adults do not feel that way inside. They feel, in many ways, exactly as they always did. Their opinions are still strong, their humor is still sharp, their desire for genuine human connection is just as powerful as it was at 30. The gap between how society sees them and how they see themselves is one of the most painful and least discussed aspects of growing old. And it is one of the things that Margaret, sitting at that kitchen table with her untouched cup of coffee, felt most acutely. There is a particular kind of grief that older people carry that does not have a common name the way other griefs do. It is not the grief of losing a single person, though that grief is real and heavy. It is the grief of watching an entire era of your life disappear. The music that defined your youth fades from the radio. The neighborhood where you raised your children gets renovated into something unrecognizable. The slang changes, the references change, the technology changes, and slowly the world starts to feel like a place you are visiting rather than one you belong to. Researchers who study aging call this phenomenon social displacement, and it is one of the most quietly devastating experiences in the human journey. Carl Pillemer, a gerontologist at Cornell University who spent years interviewing over 1,500 Americans aged 65 and older, found that the single most common thing older people wished they had done differently was not about money or career. It was about relationships. Specifically, they wished they had worried less and invested more. More time with the people they loved. More presence. More honesty. More willingness to say the things they were feeling before time ran out to say them. One after another, these men and women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s told him that petty fights and long resentments and years of silent misunderstandings were among the greatest wastes of their lives. Margaret remembers a falling out she had with her sister over something related to their mother's estate. Neither of them can quite remember the exact details now. What she does remember is that they did not speak for almost 7 years. 7 years. And then one morning she got a call that her sister had suffered a serious health scare, and Margaret was on the next flight, and they sat in a hospital room and held hands and cried, and neither of them could quite believe they had waited this long to just be sisters again. Her sister recovered, thank goodness. But Margaret will tell you plainly that those 7 years are the thing she regrets most. Not the house she did not buy. Not the trip she did not take. Those 7 years of stubborn silence with the one person who had known her longer than anyone else in the world. This is the thing about getting older that no motivational speaker ever quite captures. The regrets are rarely about the bold moves you did not make. They are about the quiet, daily choices that accumulated over decades. The phone call you kept meaning to make. The dinner you kept rescheduling. The apology you kept drafting in your head, but never quite sent. 50 people aged between 75 and 92 were interviewed in a study by researchers at a leading editorial institute, and the single most repeated regret across all of them was worry. Not the things they worried about, but the act of worrying itself. They described years of their lives consumed by anxiety over things that never happened, concerns that dissolved on their own, fears that turned out to be nothing. And they said, with remarkable unanimity, that they wished someone had told them earlier to stop, to breathe, to trust that most things work themselves out, and to spend that mental energy on the people sitting right in front of them. Margaret says she spent a large portion of her 50s and 60s quietly worried. About money, about her children's choices, about her health, about whether she was doing enough, being enough, saving enough. She was so preoccupied with potential future problems that she sometimes missed the actual present joy sitting right in her living room in the form of 3 kids who were healthy and funny and full of life. She knows that now. She would give a great deal to go back and just sit on the floor and play with them a little longer instead of cleaning the kitchen for the 4th time that week. One of the most profound and underreported shifts that happens as people age is the change in what they find meaningful. The ambitions and status markers that drive so much of midlife, the promotions and the bigger house and the recognition from peers, begin to lose their grip. What rises in their place is something quieter and more fundamental. A craving for authenticity. A hunger for real conversation. A desire to spend time with people who feel safe rather than impressive. Researchers describe this through a theory called socio-emotional selectivity, which essentially proposes that as people perceive their time as more limited, they become far more selective and intentional about how they invest their emotional energy. They stop tolerating superficiality not because they have become difficult, but because they have finally become honest. Margaret describes this shift with clarity. She says that in her 40s she would have attended a party she did not want to go to, worn a smile she did not feel, and said everything was fine when it was not, all in the name of keeping up appearances. Today, she says, she would rather sit quietly in her garden and watch the birds than spend 2 hours in a room full of people she barely knows, performing a version of herself she has long outgrown. This is not bitterness. This is clarity. And it is one of the genuine gifts of age, this ability to finally know what you actually want and to stop apologizing for it. But clarity without connection is its own kind of ache. And this is where the emptiness that Margaret described at the beginning begins to make its full meaning clear. Because what so many older adults are experiencing is not a failure to adapt to the world. It is a profound mismatch between what they now understand to be truly valuable, genuine human presence, deep conversation, shared memory, and what the modern world is actually offering them, which is surface-level interaction, digital substitutes for intimacy, and a cultural message that youth and productivity are the only forms of worth. That mismatch, that daily collision between what the heart knows and what the world provides, is the quiet tragedy at the center of the aging experience for millions of people. The AARP research survey findings reinforce this starkly. Major life transitions like retirement, children moving to other cities, and the loss of close friends and spouses are among the most powerful triggers for loneliness in older adults. And what separates those who navigate these transitions with some sense of peace from those who spiral into isolation is, more than any other factor, the quality and maintenance of their close relationships before those transitions hit. In other words, the time to build the support network you will need in your 80s is not in your 80s. It is now, while you still have time and energy and proximity. This is something Margaret understands with the full weight of hindsight. She wishes someone had told her in her 50s, while she was still busy being busy, that the friendships she was letting quietly fade were not just pleasantries. They were lifelines. She wishes someone had told her that the colleague she always said she would catch up with would one day stop being reachable, not because of any conflict, but simply because life moved on and the thread between them got too thin to hold. She thinks about people like that often. People who were important to her once, and are now just names in old photo albums that her children will one day sort through without knowing the stories behind the faces. There is a woman named Dorothy who is 83 years old and who agreed to share her story because, she says, if one person hears it and makes a different choice, then the telling of it will have been worth something. Dorothy spent the majority of her adult life being enormously productive. She ran a small accounting firm, raised 2 children largely on her own after a difficult divorce, and was by every external measure a success. She was proud of what she had built. She still is. But she will tell you, in the direct way that very old people tend to speak when they no longer have time for softening the truth, that she worked too much. Not in a vague, abstract way. In a very specific, painful way. She missed her daughter's school play because of a client deadline. She missed her son's graduation weekend because of a quarterly report. She told herself these choices were temporary, that there would be time later, that what she was building would benefit all of them in the long run. And in some ways it did. Her children did not grow up wanting for anything material. But Dorothy says that her daughter, who is now 54, recently told her that what she remembered most from childhood was not the vacations they took with the money Dorothy earned or the college Dorothy paid for. What she remembered was watching her mother leave for work in the dark and come home after she was already in bed. What she remembered was a particular kind of longing that she carried for years without quite having the language for it. Dorothy cried when she told that part of the story. Not dramatically. Just the quiet tears of someone who is old enough to no longer be ashamed of them. She said that hearing her daughter describe that childhood longing was one of the hardest things she had ever experienced, not because it was an accusation, but because it was simply true, and truth at 83 lands differently than it does at 40. There is no revision possible. There is only the acknowledgement of it and, if you are fortunate, the chance to do better with whatever time remains. What Dorothy and Margaret and so many others in their 8th and 9th decades have come to understand is something that younger generations tend to know intellectually, but rarely feel with their full selves. Time does not stretch. It compounds, and then it contracts, and the years that felt endless in your 20s and 30s begin to pass with a speed that feels almost aggressive by your 70s. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of human happiness ever conducted, followed individuals for over 80 years and arrived at one central finding. The quality of your relationships is the single strongest predictor of how happy and healthy you will be as you age. Not wealth. Not status. Not achievement. The depth and warmth of your human connections. Dorothy says she wishes someone had handed her that finding when she was 35 and let her truly feel what it meant. Not read it like a fortune cookie. Feel it in her bones the way she feels it now. She thinks she might have made different choices. Not in the grand, dramatic sense of quitting her career and moving to a cabin in the woods. Just small choices. Showing up to the school play. Putting the phone down at dinner. Saying yes more often to the ordinary Tuesday evenings that turn out to be the ones people remember. So what do we do with all of this? What does the wisdom of a 79-year-old Margaret and an 83-year-old Dorothy actually ask of us? It does not ask for perfection. It does not demand that we abandon ambition or ignore responsibility. What it asks is something far more achievable and far more radical at the same time. It asks us to pay attention, to treat the ordinary moments of connection as the sacred things they actually are, to call the person you have been meaning to call, to sit in the room with the people you love without the distraction of a screen, to say the thing you have been holding back because you were waiting for the right moment, because the right moment is never guaranteed, and older people know that in a way that younger ones simply cannot yet. The research supports every part of what these women are saying. Studies consistently show that the quality of social relationships is not just emotionally significant, but biologically consequential. Loneliness triggers the same stress responses in the body as physical pain. It elevates cortisol, disrupts sleep, weakens the immune system, and accelerates cognitive decline. Conversely, strong social bonds are associated with longer telomeres, which are the protective caps on our chromosomes that correlate with lifespan. Friendship, in the most literal biological sense, keeps us alive longer. The science is not ambiguous. Human beings are social creatures, and isolation, regardless of how comfortable or well-furnished the room, is a form of harm. Margaret would not put it in those terms. She would just say that a good cup of coffee tastes better when there is someone across the table to share it with. And she would be right, because that simple truth, the one that science is increasingly confirming with data and longitudinal studies, is also the one that every grandmother has known for centuries. We are not meant to be alone. We are meant to be in community, in conversation, in relationship, in love in all its ordinary forms. And when those things are removed from us, either by circumstance or by the gradual erosion that aging can bring, something essential goes quiet in a way that no medication or senior center activity can fully restore. Here is what you can do starting today. Reach out to someone you have been meaning to contact. Not with a text, with a call, or better, with a visit. Ask them how they are really doing, and then be quiet long enough to actually hear the answer. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent or neighbor, go see them. Not because it is a duty, but because the conversation you have today may be the one they carry with them for weeks. Check on the older people in your life with the same urgency you would check on a friend in a visible crisis, because the invisible crisis of loneliness is just as real and just as damaging. And if you are the one sitting at the kitchen table with the untouched coffee and the phone that does not ring, know this. Your story is not over. Your value is not located in your productivity or your mobility or how recently you learned a new app. It is located in exactly who you have always been. Speak up. Tell someone what you are feeling. Find a community that meets you where you are, not where they think an elderly person should be. Advocate for the kind of connection you deserve. And please, talk to someone you trust, whether that is a friend, a family member, a counselor, or a doctor, because your mental and emotional well-being matter just as much as your physical health, and help is available. If this story moved you or made you think of someone you love, share it with them today. And if you found value in this conversation, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we bring you these important human stories every week, the kind that remind us what truly matters before it is too late. The stories that make us want to pick up the phone, walk through the door, and show up for the people who need us. That is why we do this. Thank you for being here.